Podium nach vorne bitten, und zwar die Referenten, wenn ihr auf unser Podium kommt. Das ist Paul Coleman, Kryger Fantini und José-Luis Bazán. Und because our three speakers at this podium now speak in English, I will also now speak in English, and I hope that everybody's fine and the translation is going on well. We are now going to focus on Europe. And I realize that it is a legitimate question to ask, how is it possible, after the video we just saw and after what we've heard in the morning, to now focus on Europe? And I would like to give you 5 arguments of why this is legitimate. The first thought is that the question of how Europe responds to the atrocities in the world is something that we have to answer in Europe. Here's the first thought. It's a question of how we respond. And as you know, our response and the response of the political authorities has been only half-hearted. Second thought. What is happening in refugee camps and refugee homes in Europe has brought the conflicts to us. And again, if we are not able or interested to look at the problem, we will not solve it. A third thought. John Paul II said, was it 20 years ago? He said that while we look at persecution of Christians in the world, we must not overlook, and then he says, quote, more subtle forms of persecution, that take place in Europe and other places in the world, that start with social exclusion, but lead all the way, he says, quote, to a social death. Social death. So he compares what is happening to some Christians in Western countries to what is going on in the countries of violence and persecution, by changing the attribute, social death. Now, I was very touched when I read about persecution of Christians in Cuba a few years ago, and it gave a number of indicators of what's happening in Cuba. And it said Cuba's persecution index, it must have been Open Doors, is on a scale of 1 to 10 is at 4, and it explained that this is because there are speech restrictions to Christians and there are job restrictions to Christians. And you could say that from a very different angle of why that is so, we would come to a similar phenomenon in Europe. But we will hear more about this now from our speakers. And there are restrictions on freedom of education in Cuba. And yes, but we see those too, don't we? Even if they are argued from a different perspective. And a last thought is that the Italian sociologist Massimo Introvigne said that intolerance or discrimination against Christians, as well as persecution, are in the end 2 sides of one coin. One might be caused by radical Islam, but the other one by radical secularism. And we do not look into problems only when people are being murdered. You know, it's our task as responsible citizens to look into things when people are being excluded and treated in an intolerant manner. You don't need to wait that somebody gets shot. And this is why if there's hostility against religion, and in this case hostility against Christianity, there's a spectrum, there's a scale. It has different forms of how it manifests itself. And we do not have to wait to answer the problems until somebody gets killed. And this is why I think what we are doing here at this conference is meaningful, namely that we look at the big questions of persecution, but we do not leave out the subtle discrimination that we are experiencing in the Western world. And I understand that for some of you that might mean we are here bridging a very big, broad gap. I understand that. But when we give answers, we must give answers to both phenomena. And since we are here together on the cause of religious freedom, we must see that it has this other dimension as well. And I think over the last years, organizations that have done great work in this area have overlooked this very question. And so we are building here a bridge. And we will see in the discussions now in the afternoon that the bridge is legitimate. And in this thought, I would like to introduce to you now our first panelist, and this is Mr. Paul Coleman, who is an expert on both of these sides of the gap. Paul Coleman works for Alliance Defending Freedom, and he heads the legal advocacy of all Alliance Defending Freedom international offices. He also heads the first European office of Alliance Defending Freedom, which was, we are very happy to say that, started up in Vienna. He has, as a lawyer, intervened at more than 20 cases at the European Court of Human Rights. And you know that there are a number of issues that are that come very close to how we live our lives that are decided at the European Court of Human Rights. And Paul was there and has successfully worked for religious freedom at these cases. He has written 2 books, and in the last years, I can happily say that we have cooperated on many levels, including the OSCE and the European Union. And it's great, Paul, to have you here in Vienna. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gudrun, and thank you all for giving up time on a Saturday afternoon to hear about these important issues. A couple of years ago, the influential Pew Forum, a research group based in the US, released a report called Rising Tide of Restrictions on Religion. And the report focused on the social hostility that believers are facing in a lot of parts of the world we heard about this morning. So in North Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. And it also focused on government restrictions. And this report found that Europe has seen one of the biggest rises in government restrictions on freedom of religion in the last few years. So despite the lessons of the last century, despite the international treaties that all of these European countries have signed up to that are meant to protect and defend freedom of religion, we are increasingly seeing the state, the government, claiming authority and control over more and more aspects of everyday life. And today, in this brief time we have now, I just want to outline 4 trends that we're seeing here in Europe, 4 legal restrictions. So we're seeing the state, the government, wanting to control what we can and can't say, the state limiting how we can act on our conscience, the state increasingly acting as a parent to our children, and the state increasingly seeking to regulate our churches. And in the brief next few minutes, I'm going to unpack each one of these. If I can work my clicker. Here we go. Number 1, state censorship, or another way of saying it, you can't say that. Earlier this month in Indonesia, thousands of people marched in Jakarta calling for the arrest and prosecution of a Christian governor. And they were calling for him to be jailed and prosecuted for blasphemy. And here in Europe, we all said, oh, that's terrible, that's awful. But we're not much different in Europe. And state censorship is not just an issue in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, it's happening here in Europe too. In fact, in the same month that this Indonesian governor was arrested for blasphemy, we saw in France Christine Boutin, a former French minister, prosecuted by French courts for comments about homosexuality and same-sex marriage. We saw Facebook being criminally investigated in Germany for refusing to remove supposedly insulting Facebook comments. And we saw a politician in the Netherlands stand trial for comments that he made about his country's immigration policies. And all of these cases in Europe are arising because of so-called hate speech laws. And these laws are the modern-day equivalent here in Europe of blasphemy or heresy. And they're used to silence controversial speech that goes against the status quo and goes against state or cultural orthodoxy. So let me give you a couple of examples of how this impacts Christians. In recent years, across Europe, Catholic cardinals and bishops have been investigated by the police for hate speech because of comments they made about the biblical position of marriage and the family. I'm not just talking about one bishop in one part of Europe or one person in another part of Europe. I'm talking about several high-ranking Catholic clergymen investigated by the police in Europe for comments they made from the pulpit on biblical issues of marriage and sexuality. Just this summer, prosecutors in Valencia initiated criminal proceedings against the Archbishop of Valencia because of comments he made in a sermon. And you can see the cardinal upon the screen, Cardinal Antonio Canizares. He was investigated by the police, and the Spanish prosecution service launched an investigation into him. And of course, it didn't go anywhere. Most of these cases never do. But a message is sent out to the rest of us that says, hey, if the state can investigate and arrest a cardinal, an archbishop, then we all have to be careful what we say. Christians have also been investigated and prosecuted for comments made against Islam. The people you see in the middle of the screen there, Ben and Sharon Vogelenzang, were Christian hoteliers in the north of England. They ran a small bread and breakfast in their own home. One day they got into a conversation with a Muslim guest about the merits of their different faiths. They had a little disagreement. Words were exchanged, but it was all pretty civil. We're talking about breakfast time in the United Kingdom here. It wasn't, it wasn't a big deal. However, she launched a complaint to the police, and an investigation was launched against this couple. A prosecution was then launched, which took a year, during which time all of the business was removed from this little bed and breakfast home, and they went to trial for hate speech. They were acquitted on the first day of the trial. The judge threw the case out, by which point they lost all of their business, never to be recovered, guest house closed. And a third group of people affected by these sort of hate speech laws in Europe are pro-life campaigners, people who are wanting to speak out on life issues and particularly speak out against abortion laws in their own country. For example, in Germany, a gentleman by the name of Klaus Annan was campaigning outside an abortion facility in Germany. And he has been arrested and stopped from doing this on multiple occasions because the doctors inside were complaining that he was violating their personality rights. And eventually this case went to the European Court of Human Rights. ADF International is one of the organizations that got involved in this case. And the European Court of Human Rights ultimately said that he was free to speak outside this abortion facility. But it shows that the margins are very fine indeed. And I think a lot of us will know of pro-life campaigners in their own countries who have been stopped or prevented from speaking out on these important issues. So when we think about the issue of free speech, we shouldn't just think about Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Pakistan. We also have to look at our own doorstep and see some of the increasing restrictions that we see here in Europe. Secondly, oh, hang on. This is very sensitive. I didn't do anything. Tell you what, I've only got 4 slides. So perhaps, Mario, you can do them. Secondly, state-sanctioned consciences. Or, in other words, you can't think that. Now, what do I mean by a state-sanctioned conscience? Well, a couple of years ago, the Norwegian health minister, Robin Kaas, he explained in the media, he said, if you deny a patient contraception or a referral for an abortion, you can't be a general physician. He said, quote, doctors have to be ready to do their duty. Now that, in my mind, is a state-sanctioned conscience. In other words, you can only express your freedom of conscience so long as it's in line with the state. If the state orders you to do something, you have to be ready to do your duty. And this attitude has spread across Europe. In the United Kingdom, two highly experienced nurses, Connie Wood and Mary Dugan, you can see them there on the screen, they were told by their public hospital that they had to supervise abortion procedures. Well, these were two highly experienced Catholic nurses, and they said, we have a conscientious objection to this. We can't supervise this. Between them, they had over 50 years' experience on that ward, but because they wouldn't supervise these abortion procedures, they were told that they could not work on the ward anymore. They appealed their case all the way through the UK court system. Ultimately, the UK Supreme Court held that they had to supervise abortion procedures. They had no freedom of conscience to opt out. In Poland, a leading gynecologist, Dr. Bogdan Bazán, gentleman in the middle of the screen, was dismissed from the department as a head of one of the largest hospitals in Poland for refusing to perform an abortion. Now, he's highly qualified. He got his first medical degree over 40 years ago. But because he refused to do this abortion procedure, he was dismissed from his position. In fact, the mayor intervened in the case to make sure that he was dismissed. Doctors and nurses are increasingly being given an impossible choice. They're being told to choose between their vocation as a doctor, as a nurse, or being told to carry out an abortion. Their faith or their job, and these things are increasingly coming into conflict in Europe. And thirdly, in Sweden, where there is a great shortage of midwives and nurses, and the government pays for their education, pays for their training, and Eleanor Grimmark was one such person. She's there on your right of the screen. In November 2013, a women's clinic rescinded a job offer to her because she would not perform abortions. They left a telephone message, a voicemail on her phone, that said that she was no longer welcome to work with them, and they questioned whether a person with such views should actually become a midwife at all. Direct quote. Her case is still going on now in Sweden, and to make matters worse, she can't find a job anywhere in Sweden. She cross-border commutes to Norway, and the government are chasing her for the fees invested in her training. Now, these cases that I just mentioned all involve employment, and some people argue that you should just leave your faith at the door, and that they have no right to act according to their conscience in the workplace. Now, we completely disagree with that, and we do not believe that we can separate our conscience, our faith, from every aspect of our life. We can't just leave our faith at the door. But what about some other areas of life? What about at home, for example? What about the freedom of parents to raise their children in conformity with their own values and convictions? Well, increasingly here, we are also seeing restrictions on freedom of religion in Europe. We're seeing the state as parents, or in other words, you can't teach that. It's another area we see huge state overreach. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Early on the morning of the 29th of August 2012, a group of 20 police officers and social workers stormed the home of the Wunderlich family in Germany. The police squad used a battering ram to open the door. They threw Dirk to the ground, and then they dragged away his 4 children, aged 7 to 14. The couple were powerless as they watched their children being taken away. And what was it that led to these terrifying events? The family had just settled down to begin its first homeschooling lesson of the year. That's right, this all happened because the family wanted to homeschool their children. Dirk and Petra Wunderlich wanted the best for their children. They felt that they could give the best education at home, and that this also allowed them to teach their children on the basis of their Christian faith. Now let's leave aside the pros and cons of homeschooling as an educational choice. Instead, the question this case raises is this: whose children are they? Are they Dirk and Petra's, or are they the state's? Who has the primary responsibility for raising and teaching these children? Is it the government, or is it the parents? And we see other challenges in the area of education as well, when children increasingly are being exposed to radical sex education in schools, and parents are wanting to opt their children out of these sex education classes and are being told by the government that they can't. So another case in Germany, and I hate to pick on Germany, it just so happens that they're pretty bad at this. Some parents in the region of Salzkotten, Germany, found out that their school was putting on a 2-day sex education course, a program called My Body is Mine, so you can imagine the sort of content involved. And children as young as 7 were being taught some of the material. It involved all sorts of sex education, including an interactive play at the end of the whole thing. And the parents, Christians as they were, thought that this was too explicit for their children. Children were too young to hear some of this content, and so they opted their children out of these classes, this 2-day program. Well, the 12 parents were then fined for doing this, fined a lot of money, and they refused to pay. They were then imprisoned for 40 days. First the father would be taken to prison, and then the mother rotated every few days for 40 days. And sadly, this was not an isolated case. Now, ADF and our other allies intervened in that case. We got involved with the school authorities, and ultimately opt-outs were provided in that region of Germany. But for the Salzkotten 12, their fines were never repaid, and their criminal convictions remained. Finally, I want to look at the fourth topic, where we might think freedom of religion is at its safest. Surely, we think, churches have a right to freedom of religion. But I want to look at the fourth topic, which is state-regulated churches, or in other words, you can't believe that. Increasingly, we're seeing the state wanting to control and regulate how churches meet together, and even some of the doctrines that those churches hold. In Turkey, for example, the law prohibits minority religions from attaining legal personality unless associated with the Sunni Muslim faith. And this essentially bars the establishment of new churches in Turkey. And we have a case at the European Court of Human Rights challenging that situation, but it's not just places like Turkey where this is an issue. We were recently involved in the case of Dimitrova versus Bulgaria. In the 1990s, Peter Dimitrova wanted to start a church in Bulgaria. And she wanted to connect it to a larger denomination, an international denomination that's very well known. But the Bulgarian authorities refused her request. And so she started to organize just very small meetings in her home instead, where there'd be a Bible study, perhaps sing a song or two and pray. And what happened next? The police broke into her home, broke into her apartment without a warrant, confiscated her religious materials, her Bibles and other things, and then sent her to the police station for interrogation before banning her from hosting such meetings again. And for almost 20 years, the Bulgarian authorities have denied any wrongdoing. In their mind, this was an unregistered, unlicensed religious meeting in the home without a permit, and it was not allowed. And we represented Peter at the European Court of Human Rights, who last year held that the police, in taking this action against her, had violated her freedom of religion and had violated the European Convention on Human Rights. And so it was a great victory for freedom of religion in one sense, but of course these sorts of cases shouldn't have to be brought in Europe. If Europe is so good at freedom of religion, then why are these cases ending up in court in the first place? And to finish, I just want to give one final case example, a case at the European Court of Human Rights from 2 years ago called Fernandez-Martinez versus Spain. Now, this is a complex case. I won't get into the details of it, but it essentially came down to this. Is the Catholic Church able to set the doctrinal standards for its priests? In fact, Fernandez-Martinez was a priest, but he disagreed with a number of different aspects of church teaching and was quite vocal about that. And so the local bishop removed his license to be a teacher in a Catholic school, and that meant he couldn't teach religion anymore in the Spanish school system. And so he sued the state, And the case went all the way up to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. Can the church do this or not? The European Court of Human Rights said yes, the church can set the doctrinal standards for its priest, but only just. It was a 9-8 decision. And I want to give you an extract from one of the judges that voted against this decision. So this is a judge of the European Court of Human Rights from 2 years ago, and this was in the judgment itself. And he said, if the convention system, that is the European Convention on Human Rights, is intended to combat totalitarianism, then there is no reason to tolerate the sort of totalitarianism that can be seen in the present case. And the totalitarianism he's referring to is the teaching of the Catholic Church. He said, and I quote, "The celibacy rule contradicts the idea of fundamental human rights and freedoms. This, in my view, should be used as a principal reason for finding a violation of the Convention." Now, what these statements by a European Court of Human Rights judge demonstrate is the fragile position that freedom of religion finds itself in, even in Europe. The judge is effectively saying, I disagree with your religious beliefs, and therefore you have no religious freedom. And I wonder where some of this thinking will go in the future, and I look forward to discussing it more on our panel this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. As always, concise, down to the point, and bringing all of us much further in thought. Thank you. And I take one sentence you said in the beginning. Hate speech laws in Europe are the blasphemy laws that we see elsewhere. That's quite a statement. Now, I would like to draw your attention to our next speaker, who you've seen already a number of times today, and this is Kryger Fantini. And Ellen is not only here as a speaker, but she's the main organizer of this conference. She's put an incredible amount of time into this as the director, the executive director of the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe, and thereby she is also my successor and the answer to my worries and the embodiment of all the hope I could possibly have had, because Ellen comes into this position as a former US criminal prosecutor. And Ellen has been working between the years 2003 and 2011, especially on the issue of crimes against women and children. And she has worked a lot with a number of NGOs and other initiatives. She is writing, contributing to things like the Austrian Economic Center, also the European Conservative. She's done many, many things. She's a great help not only in organizing things, but also with her brain work. And Ellen, I thank you very much, and here is the microphone.
Well, there's certainly no pressure after that introduction. I'm sure if my brilliance is waning in the afternoon, you'll forgive me because I've maybe used it all already. So, and we'll see if maybe I have the magic touch with this clicker so my poor husband doesn't have to do it. Okay. So, I think most of you in this room know about the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe, but I'll just give you a few details. It's an NGO that was founded in 2005, and we've reported more than 1,800 cases of intolerance and discrimination against Christians in Europe. And our cases range from the kind of governmental and state restrictions that Paul just talked about, to the more subtle or not so subtle forms of marginalizations of Christians and Christianity throughout Europe. So the question is, what is intolerance? I think we understand a bit better what discrimination is. Intolerance. So it's the social dimension of marginalization. It's moving Christians and Christianity out of the public square, out of the home, and into just perhaps one's own private feelings of faith or belief. Terminology is important, and so we're going to talk about marginalization, and I'll give you some examples of what we've seen in Europe in the last few years. So, we'll start with football. I'm an American, so I almost said soccer, but I caught myself. The Barcelona player, Neymar, maybe you've heard of him. He was one of the 3 finalists at a ceremony held in Zurich in 2016, and there was a video summarizing his brilliant, successful year as a football star. You can see in the photograph on the left, he wears very often a bandana or a head covering that says 100% Jesus. He's very, very explicit about giving the glory to God for his success. Now, the photograph on the right is the FIFA video where they've removed 100% Jesus. And why would they do that? The FIFA Code of Ethics says that people linked to the organization may not offend the dignity or integrity of a country, private person, or group of people through contemptuous or discriminatory words or actions on account of race, skin color, ethnic, national, or social origin, gender, language, religion, public opinion, or any other opinion. They said that they censored his headband so that it wouldn't offend sensibilities of the viewers. Then we have the media pushing Christianity and Christian belief to the margins. After the tragic shooting in Orlando, Florida, some German newspapers wrote editorials opining that the shooter could easily have just been a Christian because of particularly evangelical Christians' views on homosexuality. In Estonia, in the National Museum, there's a new exhibit that invites the viewers to kick a virtual image of the Virgin Mary in a glass box. And once they've kicked the Virgin Mary, the image appears to fall to pieces and the word Reformation appears. Now, maybe you don't know this, but Estonia actually, in Estonia, the Virgin Mary has a very special meaning because the country is popularly known as the Land of Mary. In Spain, religious images were prohibited in a school Christmas card designing contest for children. And the Archbishop in Italy was disinvited from an elementary school pre-Christmas visit because they didn't want to offend the non-Christian students there. This is in Budapest, in front of the Polish embassy. You see pro-abortion activists dressed as a bishop, handing out abortion pills, calling it communion, and those receiving the pills were instructed to repeat the words, body of Christ. So we also have vandalism as a hate crime. The OSCE and other bodies recognize vandalism as a hate crime if it has a anti-religious bias or motivation. So here's an example. Last Christmas time, last Advent, in Albino, Italy. This is the Christ child snatched from a creche in a public square and smashed. Then we have this summer on the Austrian-Bavarian border, summit crosses. Maybe some of you are familiar with these. These are wooden crosses at the tops of summits. From May to August of 2014, 4 of them, and these are enormous, by the way. These are enormous structures. 4 wooden summit crosses in the region were destroyed by perpetrators using an axe. After one of those crosses was rebuilt, then in November, this new cross was then also chopped down. And this chopping of crosses, summit crosses, led to a discussion about whether they should be there at all. And there was a question about whether it was appropriate to show them even on private property. In Hungary, the baby Jesus is also smashed apart. Lyon, France. This is in Traunstein, Germany, Pope Benedict, spray painted pink. So, actually, I'm going to go back. Okay, so then let's talk about vandalism of cemeteries and Christian graves. We've seen quite a lot of vandalism, destruction of these sites. But interesting is a phenomenon we've also noticed, which is that they tend to be described by the media and officials as destruction of municipal cemeteries. And this puzzled us, and we wondered if maybe it was just our imagination because we're obsessed with all things that happen to Christians. But in fact, we were correct. We were correct, and I'll prove it maybe. Okay, so the top slide is from a morning news broadcast in France talking about statistics over the years. Christian cemeteries, 206. Jewish cemeteries, 6, and Muslim cemeteries, 4. This is for destruction in cemeteries. By noon, by the lunchtime news rebroadcast, they changed one word. They changed Christian to municipal in reporting the destruction of cemeteries, and they left the other two the same. So it's not necessarily that we're paranoid. We might actually be right that the media is involving itself in this kind of discourse. So, destruction of Christian graves. Then we have churches. We have churches being vandalized on the outside, sprayed on the building, drink the blood of our abortions. You all can read that. Oop. This is in Slovenia. And in fact, what it says, in addition to what I have there, is take the power from the church and give it to women. And this is a pro-abortion message. And it was during the anti-abortion prayer campaign, 40 Days for Life. In Sweden, the Catholic Church in a town in Sweden was a repeated victim of attacks, hate graffiti. You can read this, broken windows. And so the pastor filed no fewer than 15 police complaints in 2015. And the police said, you know, what you should do is get a closed circuit camera to protect your building. So when you have vandalism, it will be recorded and you can provide this to the police. So the priest asked the administrative board of the town to authorize the installation of closed circuit TV cameras, and the board rejected the application on the ground that the church's interest in solving these crimes is outweighed by an individual citizen's interest in not being recorded out in public. So, 1 week later, an unknown person threw a rock through the window after they denied permission, and this is now the 20th incident. This was the 20th incident since June. So then we have vandalism in the form of graffiti relating to churches, church themselves. So, fire will save us from the church. Oop. The only church that enlightens is a burning one. Well, the next logical step, set churches on fire. Utter destruction. A Molotov cocktail was used to set fire to a Lutheran church in Sweden. Then we have someone who described himself as a jihadist, a Moroccan man. He admitted setting a fire that destroyed an ancient altarpiece and beautiful images in the church of Fontelas de Navarre in September, the day the Catholics recognize as the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. And according to the police, the burning of the Virgin was strictly for ideological reasons of a religious character. The court considered this an Islamist attack and issued a restraining order against the man, prohibiting him from coming within 10 meters of Catholic churches or any buildings or places used for Catholic worship. The man was arrested a week later for destroying the cross atop of another church, violating his restraining order. Oh. So we have destruction outside the church, we have arson inside the church, and we have desecration. That's the theft and destruction of holy places and objects. Maybe you know about this. This was an artist in Pamplona, Spain, who used over 200 stolen consecrated hosts for a public display which reads pedophiles. And this exhibit was publicly funded by the city of Pamplona. And then it was followed by copycats who would also steal consecrated hosts for their own art projects. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. I'll move a little faster than this. So we have attacks on activists, pro-life activists. We have attacks on schools. A German evangelical academy was attacked to coincide with International Women's Day, and they attacked it by, let me just go to it. So it was a paint bomb attack, but it was timed to coincide with the International Women's Day, and it criticized this evangelical academy because it conveyed, quote, a backward, deeply heterosexist image of gender, and that it is part of a network which spreads a heteronormative worldview. That's the reason for the attack. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for the complete and utter destruction of the National Association of Assyrians, Christians in Sweden. Then we have churches in France, in Belgium, repeated attacks, weekly, daily. The church a victim of 2 fires in one day. And then you have threats. Convert or die. This is in Sweden. Convert or die. That doesn't mean convert from Islam to Christianity. It means the reverse. And a Christian family in the UK has been forced to flee their home for the second time because their neighbors in the Muslim community in which they live so disapprove of the conversion from Islam to Christianity that there have been physical attacks and now threats that the police believed were credible enough to force them to move. So I'll move along. France on high alert. It's important to know that after the Bastille Day, after the attack on Bastille Day in Nice, France was on the highest terror level alert, and 12 days later, France on the highest terror alert it could possibly be on. You have the martyrdom of Father Jacquemin. So, this polite persecution, this intolerance, it's just words, it's just threats, it's just graffiti. If we don't take it seriously, it can lead to worse, and in fact, we've seen it lead to worse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for showing us what's happening, and there's thousands of more photos also on our website, and you can actually use the search engine on intolerancegainschtchristians.eu in order to search according to time frame, country, incident, but also, and I think that needs to be underlined, you can also search for the motivation of the incident. Because here you had examples of Islamistic attacks and you had secularist issues, and we have separated the cases into many different categories. And if you say, I'm interested in one issue, not the other, you can actually get a search engine output that you might find very helpful for the questions you're asking yourselves. I would now like to introduce our third speaker, and that is José-Luis Bazán, who works as a legal advisor to the Committee. The Committee is the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the European Community. And to explain in my own words what it is, it's the representation of the bishops of the Church through the European Union that has a number of lay people work there and help make sense of the issues and issue policy papers. And what is here just called in the official description a legal advisor really is the one who does the legal brain work for the bishops in Europe with regard to European Union issues. And José-Luis has a PhD in international law. He also works as an assistant professor of human rights at the University of La Rioja. José-Luis, thank you so much for coming and joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gudrun. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's quite hard, I presume, for all of us to be here sometimes after lunch, after a long day. But I will try to do my best also to make it easier. I know that from a legal perspective it can be even harder, but I'll do my best, I promise. And if at a certain moment I see your faces, I will restrict myself. I don't know. I will not need the state to restrict me in this case. The topic proposed is quite uncomfortable for the mainstream media and for the mainstream society. That's why we talk about that here, certainly. It's hard to talk about refugees in Europe when they are not in the front line in Greece, Malta, or Italy, but they are already in the destination country or the transit country. But if we talk about Christian refugees or asylum seekers, and we can use different expressions, it's even harder because we have the problem of unreported cases of invisibility as usual. I think that I'm not at all the kind of person that is, again, can you help me, Maria? Thank you. There is a general presumption, the presumption that once asylum seekers, Christian or non-Christian, are in Europe, they are safe and sound and fully protected. Probably this is true in paper, but we find that this is untrue in practice. We've read some reports about extreme Islamic asylum seekers threatening, harassing, and acting violently against other peers or Christian peers in refugee centers and asylum seeker centers in countries such as Germany, Sweden, France, the Netherlands, and probably others. Well, this is the picture of, I could say, quite acceptable reception center in Germany. Of course, not all of them are like that, but at the same time we can see that there is extreme closeness and lack of privacy. I give you this because it also permits to understand a little bit the context in which asylum seekers are in these centers. Which is the phenomenology of behaviors, actions that are suffering Christian asylum seekers in these centers. It goes from harassment, it was mentioned the question of being threats or being under coercion to practice Ramadan. We've seen other cases of tensions and threats because Christian asylum seekers are wearing crosses or they're having their Bibles or they're in worship, they are praying. Some cases of physical violence and a particular concern, which are, as usual, what in Europe we consider the most vulnerable, which are basically children and women when it comes to sexual abuse or sexual assault. One particular case, which is more and more frequent is the question of conversion to Christianity, of course, not the other way around, as it was said. We have cases of Afghans in Germany, Denmark, Iranians, and this, of course, creates a new problem. There are even some suggestions, not all of them purely suggestions made by media, that this decision is taken exactly not to be sent back to their countries. Because once you're a Christian, if you come back to certain countries like Afghanistan or Iran, probably you're under threat. So there is a principle, it's called, legally speaking, the principle of non-refoulement. It means the principle of not being sent back to the place where you are in danger. This could be a frivolous, in some cases this is a frivolous accusation. And of course we cannot accept as a matter of principle that a person who has converted is necessarily fake and false. We cannot accept that. There can be cases, we cannot deny that, but we cannot accept as a general principle that these people should be under suspicious. This is not the healthy approach to the phenomenon of conversion. We have to go to the truth, we have to make more research if it's necessary, but we don't have to see these people as suspicious of fake conversion in order to get protection or more, let's say, chances to be protected under the EU asylum law. Please. One of the most, if not the only, structured report, recent report on the situation of Christian refugees and asylum seekers in reception and detention centers in Europe is the one which you have outside of one of the co-sponsors of this conference, Open Doors. Quite recently this year, they published, I don't know, 1 or 2 reports on the issue in Germany, again, about the hundreds of cases in which certainly it was possible to detect, to prove, and to provide evidences about the situation of those who are victims of crimes. We are not talking about tensions or dissenting opinions. We are talking about criminal acts. Coercion is in every single civilized country, and in Europe still we can presume that. It's a crime, as it is a threat to a person who receives a threat or who receives a menace to be killed, for example. Please. Well, other images that can illustrate the question in different countries, in Greece, not to focus only in Germany, there are other countries in which this happens. Please, next. I just want to touch upon another dimension of the suffering of Christian refugees and asylum seekers, which is not only the question of relations among peers with other non-Christian, in particular with these radical Islamists who are threatening them, but also the question of the lack of sensibility sometimes, ignorance some others, and maybe we cannot exclude that, sometimes hostility of certain public authorities in asylum units. I just put an example of the UK because it has received a quite interesting answer by the UK Parliament group. Intergroup is a cross-party group. All groups of the UK Parliament have condemned the attitude of certain asylum seekers officers in the UK. Here you can find even in BBC the information and an article of this writer, which is expressing exactly a very stupid way to proceed when it comes to the assessment of the asylum application. You can read that Mohammed, an Iranian asylum seeker, converted, fighting to stay in the UK. But he found the asylum interview quite bizarre because he was questioned. You can imagine an interview in which an asylum seeker is in front of 1, 2, 3 persons, and one of the asylum seekers office units, the officer, UK officer, is asking, which is the color of the Bible? What do you mean with the color of the Bible? I suppose that it depends on the Bible. It can be red, blue, whatever, of the front of the Bible. This stupid question was made to him just to assess if he was a real converted Christian. But the number of questions are so stupidly, or so difficult, because it belongs to the domain of the theological knowledge. And of course, theology is connected with religion, But these people are recent, converted in a framework where usually they do not receive a quite systematic religious education, and probably if they start to ask questions about technicalities, let's say, of the Christian religion, probably some of them will fail. For example, which are the 10 Commandments in order? Well, I'm not going to make that question here, of course. It will not be polite. But we can start with a number of questions which probably will make us to think about what we learned 40, 50, 60 years ago. Maybe we knew it 50 years ago. But sometimes, well, what is the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, sometimes, you know. But these are the kind of questions. If you don't understand that the procedure is a little bit poisoned, I'm not going to assess if it's intentionally or not. But the question is that it does not reveal exactly if the person is a Christian, a recent Christian, converted Christian or not. Please. These are, in my view, some of the elements to understand the current situation on the phenomenology of the harassment of Christian refugees. The first is what I already mentioned, the question of lack of visibility, either social or political, because of many mixed reasons. Probably, of course, victims are afraid. Once you're known as a person who complains, you're in the middle of the fight between the public officers and the rest of the peers, particularly those who are the aggressors. Secondly, we know that we live in an environment which is, and this is a topic of a recurrent topic in every single meeting and conference, the question of political correctness, which is very, very damaging. It's extremely damaging. We have seen, for example, the case of rapes for years and years in a certain Pakistani community in the UK, for the only reasons that the policy officers did not want to know about that. They were afraid of being accused of xenophobic, Islamophobic, and so on. Similarly can happen in this case. Nobody wants a problem. They all know that finally even it will not be their boss, it will be the media, it will be the high politicians, the ministers who finally will be obliged by the mainstream thinking to take a decision against that person who is just fulfilling his duty. Thirdly, I could say that there is a mixing feeling in media. Sometimes they just ignore. Some of the times they are not interested. They think that people are not interested in that. Of course, it just goes even again the media ethics. You have to report on what's going on, the reality. And it reveals a certain bias to select as a menu what is going on if, in your understanding, which is usually mainstream understanding, this should be put on in the middle of the public debate. I must say that, accepting this report, there is a problem of measurement of the situation. We don't know exactly how many, we don't know exactly the proportion of the question. What we know is that this is not a punctual phenomenon. This is not a question of isolated cases. Every time I ask my German colleagues, they all deny. I'm sorry to say that, but I ask, what about this? No, this is just one case. No, this is an isolated case. And after that, the report of Open Doors appeared, and many of them trying to put into question that. Maybe for methodological reasons, but it was under suspicious again. So it's not a neutral approach to a reality, it's a biased approach again. Even though if we want to be fair, sorry, the previous one, just to finish a little bit, yeah. We all know that, again, human being is quite complex, and we have also to understand that there can be religious elements and there can be other elements. We have seen that image of the reception center in which people were very close. I mean, tension sometimes start with a little thing which is nothing to do with religion, but then all passions, including the religious component, goes to the discussion and tension. But we don't have to deny that this element exists. We don't have to deny that others can exist. Finally, also one of the questions related to the isolated cases is that the immediate question when you put this topic on the table is, but is this systematic? My answer is, do you need a systematic rape of all women to deal with one single case, or what? If it's a crime, you need just one single case to be prosecuted. You don't need a systematic repetition of the crime. So we're talking about crimes. We're not talking just about disagreements or tensions as a general and vague. We're talking about something which is in the criminal code, and the criminal code obliges the public prosecutors, the courts, magistrates, police enforcement officers to operate. It doesn't matter even the consent of the victim. Even if the victim goes against, they have to go with that. Please. I will try just to resume the 2-3 last slides about exactly the way that, in general, all victims of crime should be dealt with. This is not my elaboration, it's the European Commission, which is summarizing a little bit the current EU legislation when it comes to victims of crimes. If a Christian are a victim of crimes, they also have these rights. For example, respectful treatment recognition as a victims, not re-victimization of a second victimization, the support in all areas, including psychological assistance, the access to justice. This is a very critical issue. Respecting and protecting anonymity. Okay? Finally, and not less, when we talk about just situation, justice, we talk about compensation and restoration of the position of the person. Please, next. There is a legislation in the European Union which is the so-called Victims' Rights Directive of 2012. And again, from this legal point of view, there are very concrete, very well-detailed rights which are recognized to all, but also to Christian refugees when they are victims of crimes. For example, the right to access to information, the question of special support services, and more legally speaking, the two last, which is first the right to see a decision reviewed when the decision decided finally not to prosecute the aggressor, or the right, which is an individual right, to identify the vulnerability and the special protection measures for these victims. When it comes to proposals, I'm not going to deal much with that because there will be a second speaker, as far as I understand, in the next panel, which will deal with proposal. I will probably just focus, maybe just go to the next, please. I will focus on 2 or 3 which are more legal-minded. The second one, which is the revocation and or not renewal of a refugee status for the aggressor. We have that in law. This is European Union law. This law, which is called Qualification Directive in force, is going to be reviewed. That's why I quote the new reviewed proposal, which is not directed by regulation, quite recent, July this year. But the right is very clear, and the duty is very clear. If an aggressor commits a crime against other, including a Christian refugee, this person can be legally expelled. And secondly, the question of the access to centers by religious people. Well, of course, this has to be done in a way that does not put at risk the person, because if you are visited by a priest in a detention center where you are at risk because of the other or some others who are just harassing you, it has to be done in a way that the person is protected. I also suggested that one good way to deal with these cases is to permit that Christian refugees are not in detention centers. You know that both detention centers are closed centers, they cannot go out, it's like a prison, so they have to be all the time in. But the reception centers, they have a certain timetable, they have certain obligations, but they can go out. So for Christians, for example, it will be better, much easier to go out, to go to a temple, because nobody knows that, so it's a privacy. But if the person has to be all the time in, it will be very easy for the rest to detect that this person is either a Christian or has converted into Christianity. Finally, I could say that it's very important that not only persons like Paul or other legal advisors, but even voluntary persons, legal advisors, help them. They need help in terms of legal protection. Why? Because it's not so easy for them to access lawyers or to access anyone who can really help them in assisting in their legal rights. I think that this is one of the challenges we have, because certainly the protection is not only support, but also protection in terms of legal rights to avoid that public authorities or some public authorities do not fulfill their duties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, José-Luis, Bazán. It's interesting what you say, because we are having this discussion also in Austria, and that you say that your German colleagues don't want to see that is also something that we have seen in the debates in Austria. And we will hear a little bit more about this in the second session, because we were raising now the questions of what's going on in Europe, and our next podium will deal with what we can actually do. And we have a great speaker, Paulus Kurt, who is the person responsible in finding answers to this, who will tell us what he is doing in Germany. Now, we have 15 minutes for discussion. No? So Ellen is the boss, yeah? She says, no, we don't. Can we take...
Break, it's 15:45.
So we have 1 minute for discussions.
We have 1 minute.
So here's one, we take one question, and it's an urgent question, I can see. We have looked at what's going on in Europe, and we looked at three aspects: the legal restrictions, the social hostility, and the specific current issue of the refugees. And here is our question. Someone has a microphone, maybe? There. Yes.
Thank you. A question to Mr. Bazán. You made a very broad claim that the harassment of Christian refugees in detention and reception centres in Europe are by quote-unquote extreme Islamists. What do you have incontrovertible evidence that every act of harassment of a Christian refugee in detention and reception centres in Europe is done by an extreme Islamist?
José-Luis, an answer.
Yes. Now? Yeah. Well, I just expressed two caveats in my intervention. First is that there's a lack of information, and that the only critical structure report that we have for the moment is the report of Open Doors concerning Germany. What I have is information, contrasted information of some cases. And the second caveat is exactly what I mentioned, that we have to pay attention to the religious dimension, but also other elements that can mix. For example, the ethnical or the lack of privacy and so on. What we probably have to do just to fulfill this gap is what it has been suggested by a former lawyer who was working this issue, saying that probably we have to look for the activation of the legislation in our countries which allow us to know about what's going on when it comes to public documents. For example, what I know is that in Germany it exists a legislation, or even the European Union, in Spain, other countries, in which every single citizen can address the authorities asking information about a particular case. For example, we don't know yet the number of cases in which asylum seekers, as in other asylum seekers, have been either fined, transferred to other place, or even condemned by a court. So we need to activate that. We know that it happens. We know that usually it does not go through the regular channel of law cases. It does not go through that. So usually it goes just placing these people, the victims, in other place, or trying to arrange that in a different way and manner. So we have a real problem because people are afraid, and they do not reveal that. Sometimes it's a second part in a chain information, and we have to go into that. That would be my answer. I'm not acting as a litigator in these cases. If you ask for evidences, usually is the person who is collecting for a legal case before a court. I'm a legal advisor, I'm not a litigator. If you're looking for concrete cases, I can address you the people who are dealing on the ground. I'm not dealing with ground cases, I'm dealing with policy cases.
Thank you very much. I think we will continue this debate, and I would like to point out now, to take you into that break, that the people who made this discussion possible at all is really Open Doors. And we would like to thank Open Doors for this. And there's Kurt Igler here. So if you have more questions, ask Kurt directly. This is Kurt, yes? So thank you to Open Doors, really. And I would now also like to introduce to you one auxiliary bishop from Vienna, Weihbischof Franz Scharl. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. Welcome, Franz Scharl. Now, in the break, please do make use of the information desks out there, meet and mingle. And we will, in the next half hour, put our group picture with the drawings of Syrian children that were done by Syrian children online. And if you would like to be tagged in this picture so that we can receive a very broad reach, then you have to like the page of the Observatory on Facebook, right? So take your phones and then you go to Observatory on Intolerance Against Christians in Europe, you like it, and then tell Ellen, because she will be sitting here with her computer, to tag you. And the more we can tag, the broader this will go out. Please share the image. It will be our message to the Syrians. Thank you very much and enjoy your coffee.